Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Greetings, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our final session in our course, What History Class Left Out Part 2, African History from 711 to 1896 CE. So this is the last session for this course. We're going to wrap things up today. We have a break next week, and then April we will start with our next seminar, which we will talk about toward the end. I hope everyone is here, healthy and safe, and you had a good week. I can say safely made it here today to 235 Montreal Road without getting stopped and beat up by the police. So I guess it's a good day in Ottawa. And those of you that aren't in Ottawa, we had a massive situation on Monday where the young man was just walking down the street. Police mistook him for another black man, which, happens way too often. Threw him to the ground, assaulted him, stun gunned him, then just said, "Oh, sorry, we got the wrong guy," and had him on his way. We've talked about these things in the past in our class. We'll probably continue to talk about them until systemic racism, until anti-black racism and Afrophobia is finally rid of our society. These things will continue to happen. So we can maybe talk about that more toward the end, but I just wanted to alert everyone that that happened. So if you're not in Ottawa, if you haven't followed the news, just Google that. Go to CBC and you can look up what happened to this young man who was walking on his way home. All right, so let's get into it. Today's class, we're going to wrap everything up. And again, we've been making our way throughout Africa, our counterclockwise trajectory through the geography of Africa and through African history. Today, we're going to go up to the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, talking about the Horn of Africa. So we'll be talking about Ethiopia, we'll be talking about Somalia today, and a little bit of Eritrea. But that's the region that we're going to be dealing with, that nexus between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, this strategically important area of the world. And we're going to talk about the changes that were occurring in this region and how they connected to world events, culminating in the Battle of Ottawa in 1896. So we'll talk a little bit today about colonization, the beginnings of colonization, and why Africa was colonized in the 19th century. And we'll finish up by talking about how the Kingdom of Ethiopia was able to effectively resist European colonization. And we will problematize the Kingdom of Ethiopia. We'll talk about this empire and the counterbalancing of that empire with the experiences of everyday people that would become Ethiopians in terms of the modern idea of the nation state of Ethiopia. This is where this state grows during this time period, the 19th century going into the 20th century. So we'll talk about the growth of that empire. So this is what we'll get into today. Last week, we talked about another empire. We talked about Southern Africa. We talked about the Zulu Empire. We talked about Great Zimbabwe. We talked about the role of the Portuguese, who will also come up again in today's conversation. So a lot to discuss. Make sure you're taking notes. Everything, again, that we talk about, if you've missed any of the courses, if you want to get more information or more details on any of the topics that we bring up, please use the course website. It's free. It's curated for you. We have recordings going back 2-3 years, various class sessions. We have books, book chapters, articles, so on and so forth. So please use that resource. So again, geographically speaking, here's where we're at. We're talking about the Horn of Africa, right? Where you see Ethiopia and Aksum there. This is what we are getting into today. And of course, Somalia as well, Djibouti, Eritrea, that entire region. So we've made our way counterclockwise throughout Africa. In part one of this class, all the way back in last July, actually, when we did part one of this course, we talked about the prominence of the Kingdom of Aksum. the Empire of Aksum that dominated trade in the Red Sea region around 500 CE, starting around 300 CE, but moving into 500 CE, 600 CE. This was a dominant player in world economics, the Kingdom of Aksum. But all empires decline at some point, and the Kingdom of Aksum went through a decline. And as a result, we get the Zagwe dynasty that emerged in what's now modern-day Ethiopia. That dynasty lasted for about 300 years, a little over 300 years, until we get to the Solomon dynasty. The Solomon dynasty emerges in what's now Ethiopia, part of Eritrea, in 1270 CE. Now, this dynasty is the one that continued all the way up really until actually, there's a short break, but we can really say the Solomon dynasty continued from 1270 all the way up to 1974, 1975, because this is the dynasty to which Haile Selassie I was a member. This was a family that traced their lineage back to the union between King Solomon of the Kingdom of Israel and the Queen of Saba, or the Queen of Sheba, for those of you that know that Old Testament. That is the origin story of this dynasty. That's what gives this dynasty their legitimacy. The offspring of Solomon and the Queen of Saba, Menelik I, had come. He's born in Ethiopia. His mother gets pregnant when she's visiting Solomon in Israel. He's born in Ethiopia, but his father sends from him. This is all part of the origin story. So I'm not presenting this to you as if this is definite history and we have this definite historical chronicle of the things that Menelik I did. This is part of the larger national narrative. So it's important historically, but I'm not saying this actually happened historically. So I want to be very clear on that. So Menelik I goes back to his father. He gets the Ark of the Covenant and he brings it to Ethiopia. And it's supposedly still there to this day. There's a church in Ethiopia that has armed guards, and there's only one priest that can go into the sanctuary of this church and on a certain day of the year and engage with the Ark of the Covenant. But it's supposed to be there. And I believe something is there. I mean, you're not going to have armed guards for nothing. So yeah, look that up. If you go on YouTube or Google, just Google Ethiopian church with the Ark of the Covenant and the Ten Commandments, and you'll get the video. One of the more famous videos of this is when Henry Louis Gates, the Africana scholar at Harvard, goes there. I think he went in the late 80s, early 90s as part of a PBS series on African history. And he actually kind of acts really, really American when he goes there. It's kind of arrogant, but they don't let him in the church, and they don't let him near the Ark of the Covenant. They don't let anybody near it. But anyway, that is the origin story of this dynasty. That's why it's called the Solomon dynasty. So the emperors that emerged out of this dynasty had a strong connection to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So the church and the empire were like this. So we're going to talk about that development. And Christianity, even going back before this dynasty, before the Zagwe dynasty, going back to ancient Aksum, we know that this region had been heavily Christian. By the time we get to the Solomon dynasty, Islam has made its presence felt in this region, particularly in Somalia, what will become Djibouti. Somalia, and even further south, as we talked about, is Islam had made its way down the Swahili coast and the emergence of the Swahili city-states. So Israel's a major player in East Africa. Then, of course, on the other side of the Red Sea, in Yemen, and Southern Arabia, so on and so forth. We talked about in our previous class the relationship between Ethiopia and Islam, how when the Prophet's followers were fleeing Mecca, they found refuge, or a portion of his followers found refuge in Ethiopia. And Muhammad writes in the Quran that Ethiopians are to be honored for their assistance to the early development of Islam. So you had this relationship, and for a long period of time, it was relatively peaceful. The relationship between Christian Ethiopia and the Islamic nations that were emerging, including the Adal Sultanate, which we'll talk about, which is, around modern-day Somalia, and of course the Swahili city-states, and eventually even further north, because what you see is Kush or Nubia or Sudan will become Muslim as well. They were Christian for a long time, but by the time we get into the 1500s, Islam is making its way into Sudan as well. Relationships were relatively peaceful until the emergence of the Solomon dynasty. And now economic considerations are starting to creep up. As this dynasty unifies Ethiopia, it becomes a world player. They now see the Islamic states to its east and to its south as competitors. So what starts out as economic competition, political competition, delves into religious competition. So by the time we get to the 1300s, so again, the Solomon dynasty was established in 1270. Took them a few decades. By the time we get to the 1300s, now there is a battle in this region between the two major powers, the Adal Sultanate and the Kingdom of Ethiopia. One is Muslim, one is Christian. And both sides use the religion to motivate their citizens to fight for the ruling classes. Christianity, it's almost a crusade against the Adal Kingdom. And notice what's really going on here. The Ottoman Empire, by the time particularly we get to the 15th century, has taken over control of this area that's now partially southern Sudan and Eritrea. The Ottomans are Muslim. These are the Turks. They've taken control of this region and they control access to the Red Sea. The Adal Sultanate, they control access to the Red Sea. So now the Kingdom of Ethiopia is landlocked. It's not like it was when Aksum controlled this region and they controlled access to the Red Sea and they could trade their goods either north into the Mediterranean world or south going into the Indian Ocean trade. So now they're blocked in. So the Solomon dynasty says, hey, wait a minute, we want access. And if we have to fight against this Adal Sultanate, this Islamic state here, we will do so. And of course, Adal wants to expand. They want access to the goods that are coming on, the trade, even going as far into West Africa. Those trade routes along that Sahel region. So two bulls in the same corral, as the Zulus say. You got these two bulls ready to fight. And religion becomes a key element in those battles. Jihads on the side of the Adal Sultanate, the Islamic State, and almost Christian crusades on the Christian side. So they're engaging in battle, and the Ethiopians aren't doing well. It goes back and forth, but the Adal Sultanate, it becomes very powerful, and they're able to use weapons. By the time we get to the 16th century, the 1500s, they're able to import from the Turks weapons that are developed in Europe, firearms, and they're fighting against the Ethiopians, and they're almost winning. And one of their major generals is Amir Imam. He held both positions, both Amir and Imam, Ahmed ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. But to history, he's better known as Ahmed Gran, or Ahmed the left-handed. Gran in Amharic means left-handed, so he was left-handed. It's kind of an insult, but probably maybe some historical reality. Maybe he actually was left-handed. But anyway, Ahmed Gran was an amazing organizer of people using Islam to organize, to declare jihad against the Christian Kingdom of Ethiopia. He was a great military strategist, and he was able to rally the people, and he seemed to be pretty fair. And again, and going back to the Adal Sultanate, I forgot to mention it. These are ethnic Somali folks. When we talk about Somalia and Somali history, the Adal Sultanate was one of the great kingdoms of Somali people. So you have this Somali general who's waging war against Christian Ethiopia, and he's winning. And he's winning battle after battle after battle. And part of the reason why he's winning, two major factors. One, there's a lot of division inside of Christian Ethiopia. So the Solomon dynasty establishes itself, but just like many of the dynasties and the kingdoms that we've talked about, from West Africa to Central Africa to Southern Africa to North Africa, you have succession battles. You have different regional princes that want power. So the Adal Sultanate is able to use Islam to unite its forces to fight against a disunited Christian Ethiopia. So he's winning battle after battle, so much so that he ends up conquering about 3/4 of the Kingdom of Ethiopia. He's so successful that the Emperor of Ethiopia has to make a call. He has to make a call. The call is made to our good friends, the Portuguese. So while all this fighting is happening between the 14th and the 16th century between the Ethiopians and the Somalis, by the time we get to the 1400s, late 1400s, the Portuguese are now in the region. And let's go back to our famous treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Spanish said, the Pope said, Spain, you can have everything west of this line. Portugal, you have everything east of this line. So as we talked about in West Africa and Central Africa, the Portuguese are making their presence felt throughout Africa in the late 15th century into the early 16th century. So they've made their way up the East African coast. We talked about the destruction the Portuguese wrought on the Swahili city-states and all of that. Now they're making their way into the Horn of Africa. The Ethiopian emperor appeals to them in the 1540s, Christian to Christian. They say, listen, you're Christians, we're Christians. We've been Christian a long time. I got to double check this, but I'm pretty sure Ethiopia was probably Christian a lot longer than Portugal. Actually, the Portuguese were Christian. The Ethiopian emperor back in the day, King Azana, converts to Christianity in around 350 CE. I'm not sure when the first missionaries converted the Portuguese to Christianity. I got to double check that. But anyway, they've been Christian probably just as long, if not longer, than the Portuguese. So they appeal based off of faith. And of course, the Portuguese understand the threat or the perceived threat of Islam because they're from Europe. And the whole reason why the Portuguese are doing this travel around Africa is because the Ottoman Turks control the Eastern Mediterranean. They've conquered the Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. That's now the city of Istanbul. So the Muslims control the land routes. This is the reason why the Portuguese are traveling the ocean. This is the reason why Columbus went west, because the Muslims control the eastern trade routes that go into India and Asia. So the Portuguese are trying to go around them. So they see an opportunity to strike a blow to the Ottomans. So this is almost like a proxy war, something that we see in modern times, where you have these two international powers. You have the Portuguese and you have the Ottoman Turks. And even though Turkey is Muslim, Turkey is a European country. I mean, this was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. So Turkey is Europe. It's just Eastern Europe. So you got an Eastern European power and a Western European power fighting in Africa. The Eastern European power is allied with the Adal Sultanate, the Muslims, and the Western European power is allied with Christian Ethiopia. The Portuguese are able to overwhelm the Adal Sultanate. Ahmed Gran is killed. The Muslims are pushed back, and Ethiopia is saved, from their perspective, from being Muslim. Because had the Portuguese not intervened in Christian solidarity with the king of Ethiopia, Ethiopia probably would be a predominantly Muslim country, just like Sudan, just like Somalia. But that didn't happen. So this is a very interesting time in African history, because the Portuguese thought of the Ethiopians as brothers in Christ at this point. There was a belief, a myth that went around Europe prior to this time of this kingdom of Prester John. There was a belief that there was this Christian African kingdom that was incredibly rich and incredibly wealthy, and if only we could get to that, we could establish this relationship. So there was a belief that Ethiopia was the kingdom of this mythical figure, African king named Prester John. So at this point in the early 1500s, the Portuguese see the Africans as brothers in Christ, at least the Ethiopians. So they help their brothers defeat them. Now, a few decades, while all this is going on, while these two major polities are fighting each other, from the south coming into this region, you have the Oromo people. Now, this is a very important migration because if we look at the demographics of the modern nation state of Ethiopia, again, which is bigger than this, what we have designated here as the Kingdom of Ethiopia, Oromo people are about 40% of Ethiopia's population. I was in a cab, not a cab, I was in an Uber a couple of weeks ago, coming back from high school, coming back from Glebe High School after giving a talk. And I got in the Uber, and the driver, we started talking, and I said, yeah, I was giving an African history talk. And he said, oh, I'm from Ethiopia, and he went through the whole thing, Ark of the Covenant, Solomon, all that. I'm listening like, yeah, that's, I never talk about what I know. I always listen and let people educate me. I might learn something. So he's telling me, and then he said, oh, but we got a lot of problems today in Ethiopia, and then the prime minister is one of them. And he's Oromo. So yeah, and he said, the Oromo came from Madagascar. I said, what? He said, yeah, the Oromo, man, they came recently. They came from Madagascar and they ruined everything. I said, well, maybe there's something in the history that I didn't know. I said, oh, okay. And I said, all right, well, thank you for the ride. I got out the car. I went and I Googled it. I was like, Oromo from Madagascar. I never heard that. There are different ethnic groups in Ethiopia, different nations that become part of the Empire of Ethiopia. And as a result of that conflict between ethnic groups and between nations in this empire building process, you get a lot of stereotypes, a lot of what they call, false histories. And one of them is that the Oromo are these perpetual outsiders. And one of the myths around is that they came from Madagascar. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. They're from this region, in between what's now Kenya, southern Ethiopia, this entire region. This is where the Oromo are from. They're not from Madagascar. But that's one of the things that are taught in order to claim them as outsiders or make them outsiders. But anyway, what really presents a challenge to the kingdom of Ethiopia, and this is a kingdom in every sense of the word. This is a feudal kingdom. So you had a king, you got queens, you have, the emperor, you have princes, you have regional governors, you have a feudal system, and then all this on the backs of Ethiopian peasants. And this is all going to blow up in the 20th century, but we haven't got there yet, but it's going to blow up. The Oromo come in, and unlike the Adal Sultanate, which is essentially it's a sultanate. So you have an emir, you have, a sultan, it's an Islamic-based monarchy. Ethiopia is a Christian-based monarchy. The Oromo are incredibly egalitarian and democratic. They're pastoralist people, so meaning they have herds of cattle. The way they operate, there is no king. There are age grades. Every 8 years, there's an age grade. So you are in one of these sets and you have certain responsibilities from the time that you're little to the time that you are elderly. You pass through these different age sets. When you're in the age set of the 40-year-olds, and it gets kind of complicated, not everybody in there is 40, it's really complicated, but I'm trying to simplify it as much as possible. When you get into the age set of 40, this is the age where you're in the decision-making aspect of the community. You are in a group of men, at this time it's just men, that are making decisions for the entire community, although women do have a tremendous amount of political and economic rights. So don't think that the women are being hyper-exploited, because they're not. They meet as a council. Now, they elect someone as a spokesperson of sort, but this person doesn't have absolute power. And there are a number of Oromo bands that act independently of each other. So there's no leader. And because of this, after you reach 48, you're done. Succession goes to the next group of 40. So it's a built-in succession plan. So unlike all these other nations that we've talked about, where there's always a civil war or a fight, not always, but often a civil war or a fight after a monarch dies and they need to be replaced, this moves smoothly. Once you're 48, 49, all right, the next goddess set is up. It's called the goddess system, G-A-A-D-A. G-A-A-D-A, Gada. So it's a beautiful democratic system. It's built on consultation. It's built on debate. And that built-in succession is one of the key elements of it. But in the years prior to 40, one of those age sets is the military age set. So this group, all they do is protect the cattle and engage in warfare. Sometimes it's with other Oromo bands, and then, of course, it's also with other neighboring people. Pastoralist groups need to move around quite often, and part of the Oromo oral tradition is at some point there was a famine in what's now Kenya where they were operating in, so they had to move to find new pasture ground for their animals. Seeing the weakness in this region as a result of the centuries of fighting between the Kingdom of Ethiopia and the Adal Sultanate, they see an opportunity. So the Oromo migrate north, bring their cattle, bring that one age set that's responsible for being the warrior class, the protector class. They engage in scouting. So they would scout a territory. The elders, that 40-year-old class, would make the ultimate decision of if we're going to attack, if we're going to move into that territory, or we're going to engage those people peacefully. That decision we made, and then the people would move into it. And they would fight, and they were great warriors. And because of the conflict that was here, they were able to move quite easily through this area. And as they're migrating, the king of Ethiopia, the Adal Sultanate, they're using the Oromo as mercenaries. So they're fighting for both sides while they're advancing. So there's a lot going on here. And it's really important to point that out because in the Ethiopian history, the history that was written by the largely Amara, this is an ethnic group, and Tigray-speaking folks that ran the kingdom of Ethiopia, this was looked at as almost like an invasion of these outsiders that are just coming in, destroying everybody's way up because they weren't Christian. Some of them become Christian, some of them become Muslim. But it's really an example of the bully getting bullied because empires are built off of exploitation and advancement. So when they're advancing on people, it's like, welcome to the glorious empire. You now can, become part of us. But when someone pushes back against that or they invade, then it's like, oh, these people are barbarians, these people are ruthless. So you have all of this happening. So the Oromo are making their way. The Adal Sultanate eventually, because of the weaknesses and the Portuguese attack, eventually kind of disintegrates. And the kingdom of Ethiopia is the major player in this region. The Ottomans are still there. The Ottomans still control this part of the Red Sea, but the kingdom of Ethiopia is growing. And now their battles will be primarily against these various groups of Oromo that are coming here. And some of the Oromo get, again, included into the kingdom of Ethiopia. The kingdom, different princes, as they vie for power, will use the Oromo for military advantage. So you have this relationship that is growing. As the Oromo, after the war with the Adal Sultanate is finished and attention from the Ethiopians turns to the Oromo, one of the emperors, Emperor Sesenios, Susenyos, Sesenios looks at the situation. This is in the 1570s. He remembers that the Portuguese were able to save the Ethiopians from the Adal Sultanate. So he writes letters to the King of Portugal, and at this time, Spain and Portugal are actually united. And he says, look, we need help again. We got these Oromo coming, and we need help. And to show you, how faithful I am to this idea, I'm going to convert to Catholicism, to European Roman Catholicism. Ever since the Portuguese got involved in the war with the Adal Sultanate, there had been Jesuit and other Catholic missionaries in Ethiopia. Because although they saw them as brothers in Christ, they were like, yeah, you're not really practicing Christianity the way it's supposed to be practiced. There's too many black Jesuses around here. We need some white Jesus here. I'm joking, but I mean, that's part of the cultural imperialism is your Christianity is not good enough. Even though it's an older Christianity, probably, it's not quite good enough. You're not doing it right. So you need to become Catholic. Same thing that we saw in the Congo, on the other side of the African continent. So 1570, this emperor decides he is going to become a Catholic, which means the other major power in the region, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, is going to be dissolved. And it's not going to have the support of the royalty. And no longer will the emperor have to be blessed by the patriarch in Ethiopia. This caused a lot of problems. Number one, the majority of the population, particularly the ruling class, were heavily invested in the church, both spiritually and economically. So it's not something you could just break, you could just convert like that. He starts forcibly converting people and sending out members of the ruling class to go throughout Ethiopia to force people to convert to Catholicism. One of his officials is married to a woman named Walata Petros. Walata Petros adamantly refuses to convert to Catholicism, even though her husband is tasked with going around forcing people to convert. She divorces her husband. She runs away from her husband. She's brought back and she runs away again. She becomes a symbol for the people who want to hold on to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. She's brought before the emperor. And the emperor says, I should kill you. And her husband who she divorced, but for his credit, he says, please don't kill her, just send her into exile. She goes into exile in Sudan. When she goes into exile, thousands of people follow her because they don't want to live in an Ethiopia that's not connected to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Her life is written, she's one of the few African women at this time that gets a full book-length biography. She's just an everyday woman. I mean, she's the wife of an official, but she's not a queen. She's not a queen mother. She's just a woman that said, this is my faith. I don't want to be involved in this European version of Christianity, this one article I read called it a proto-colonial version of Christianity, just so that we could fight against the Oromo, that you want the Portuguese help that bad, that you're going to give away hundreds of years of tradition of the faith that built our nation. This movement of hers would continue to grow and grow and grow until ultimately the emperor was forced to abandon his goal of trying to convert everyone to Catholicism. So this woman, in effect, was one of the key leaders in saving the tradition and legacy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. After this emperor's death, the empire and the church, continue their relationship, and it becomes stronger. Now, as much as this church deserved to be saved because it was, extension of African tradition and it's indigenous African church, that's not to say this church was above exploitation, because it wasn't. The church and the feudal lords, the kings and the queens and the Rosses of Ethiopia, the princes of Ethiopia, they worked in tandem to exploit and overtax the everyday people in Ethiopia, the peasant class, people that worked the land for these royal folks. And again, this would ultimately blow up in 1975. But it's important to know this story and this history. So Walata Petros, look up, this is a book that recently came out about her, The Life and Struggles of Our Mother, Walata Petros. It's an English translation of the book that was written about her life. So, if you get a chance to read this, it's a great read, check it out. A little bit later, probably about 100 years after this, the kingdom of Ethiopia enters a period called the Zamana Mesafin, or the era of the princes. That central authority that I mentioned with the Solomon dynasty, it breaks down. Succession disputes, regional disputes, and what you have an emperor or a Nagusa Nagast, or a king of kings in name, but he doesn't really control much outside of the capital. What you have are a number of regional governors, Rosses, princes, again, the era of the princes, that control their particular regions. And there's no strong emperor between 1769 and 1855. This is going to come to an end around the time of Kasa Hailu, or Tedros II. He is going to be the emperor that emerges to reconnect Ethiopia. He does so at a very fortuitous time, because when he comes on the stage, actually, I'll talk about him before I get into that. So he's born again around the same time that the Zulu kingdom is arising and emerging in Southern Africa, but he's also born during the beginnings of European colonization in Africa, the first modern colony in Africa, aside from the coastal colonies that the Portuguese controlled, Algeria in 1831. So he's, born around this time. He is a semi-nobleman, meaning his father had kind of like the equivalent of a governorship. He's somehow connected to the royal family, but he's really kind of a middle-class kind of guy. His father dies young, and he's actually denied the right to take over the territory that his father had administered. His mother largely takes care of him. She's a businesswoman. She raises him. He gets a little bit of education. And eventually, though, as he grows older, he is denied some of the things that he's supposed to get as a nobleman. And as a result, he becomes what's called a shifta. This is an outlaw, a bandit. The life of Kasa Hailu has often been dramatized in Ethiopian plays, I think television shows in Ethiopia, but not a lot of English-speaking people know about this figure. And I'm not praising him for everything that he did, but it's just an interesting story. Like this, sometimes when I look at African history, I think about what would make a good miniseries or a good movie. This history would. The history of Ethiopia, particularly during this time, the era of the princes, this is the real life Game of Thrones. This is about regional conflicts. This is about who's going to be the emperor. Marriages and people taking lovers and backstabbing and all of that. All of those juicy things that make for good TV and good movies, you can find during this period. And he is a charismatic figure that you could build a show around. So he becomes an outlaw on the border between Sudan and Ethiopia. And this is also during the time that the Ottoman Turks have taken over Egypt and have incredible influence in Sudan as well. So he's fighting against the Turks on the border of Ethiopia and Sudan. He's fighting against other noblemen that he feels have wronged him. And in the process of this, he's accumulating around him followers, groups of young men that are following him as an outlaw leader. This should sound very similar to what's going on in Haiti right now, where you have quote unquote gangs and these type of leaders that become political. So he builds himself up so much to the point that he becomes someone to be reckoned with among the nobles. He ends up marrying the granddaughter of the actual empress of Ethiopia. But at some point, his relationship with his outlaws begins to strain. He feels disrespected by the empress at a number of times. It's a whole story. Again, you have to read this in detail so you can really be entertained. But eventually, he gets so much power and uses his influence among the masses in his region, because he's like Robin Hood. He's really good to the people, even though he's an outlaw. For the everyday people, he shares the spoils of things, and he's well liked. Charismatic guy. His soldiers will follow him into war because he's shown himself to be incredibly brave, so on and so forth. And he, through alliances and through military conquest, he's able to defeat all these names that you see here. When you see that word, the Jot, that means governor or military, regional military figure. That's what that title is essentially in English. So you got these Rosses, which means prince. You have a king in the area of Shoa. He's able to go from region to region and ultimately unite all these regions and have himself crowned as the Nagusa Nagast on February 1855, or the King of Kings. He defeats all his rivals for a moment. As the King of Kings, he has a larger vision for Ethiopia. He wants to so he essentially puts an end to the era of the princes. He is the king, and he wants a strong central government. He wants modern education in Ethiopia. He has seen the Ottoman Turks and how they operate. He's learned about the Europeans and how they operate and other forces. He wants a modern education. He wants to end the slave trade in Ethiopia. There was an internal slave trade in Ethiopia that was going on, and a slave trade that was going, to the Muslim world, going to the east. He wanted to end that slave trade. So these were the things that he wanted to do. However, after he was crowned King of Kings, he had to go around putting down rebellions in all of these regions. So he would defeat a region, everything would seem to be good, that he controlled it. Then he would go to another region, and as soon as he left, the regional governors or the regional people and leaders in that region would rise up and not pay their taxes or whatever, just rebel against them. So then he had to circle back, put that down, and then it's like whack-a-mole. As soon as one get knocked down, another one come up. So he spent most of his time fighting to reconsolidate his kingdom while he's trying to make these modern reforms. And then all of these regional leaders, they're communicating with outside forces, the Portuguese, the British, other folks, because they want to keep things the way that they were. This is a continual thing that we'll see throughout Ethiopian history. This struggle between the regions and the central government over who's going to be in control. And it has yet to be reconciled. A couple of years ago, it was a huge war in Ethiopia because that region up there, where you see the Tigray region, there was during COVID, the prime minister said, we're not going to hold elections because of COVID, regional elections, like for governor and all that. The Tigray region said, yeah, but we want to, and you're not going to stop us, and we're going to hold them. And oh yeah, and we're also going to take control of one of the armories. So they attacked this is a continual back and forth. But at this time, he's able to do all this. But one of the things that he noticed back when he was in his outlaw days on the border between Ethiopia and Sudan, he would engage in battles with the Ottoman Turks. And he saw the weaponry that they had. He became obsessed with modern weapons. He said, if Ethiopia is going to become the superpower that I want it to be, I've seen what the British have, what the French have, what the Ottomans have, these modern weapons. We need to arm ourselves with these weapons. So he created a well-disciplined standing army. Prior to this time, the army wasn't a standing army. You had regional armies, and the governors and princes would call up people to fight for them, and of course, use the Oromo as mercenaries at some point in different points. He wanted a unified standing army based on meritocracy. So not where you were born and who you were born to, but your actual skill. And he wanted a well-disciplined army. So he wouldn't have to, keep putting down these rebellions. If they were all in one army, then there would be no rebellion. So that's what he wanted. He wanted modern arms. And as he's building, he's entering these relationships with European powers, and he wants to be equally recognized by the European powers who are making their presence known in the region as well. So this is around the 1850s, 1860s that this is happening. Eventually, what we're going to see in this region, so by the time we get to the 1900s, this is what Africa looks like. The only independent place is the Empire of Ethiopia. This is beginning during his time period. So he's starting to see in the northeast, it's the Ottoman Turks that control Egypt, Sudan. Eventually that'll go to Britain, but at this point, it's the Ottomans that control that. The Italians are making their presence felt in Somalia. The French are around, the British are around in this region. He's seeing himself encircled, so he wants to make sure that his empire is strong, that he is not looked at as any type of junior partner on the world scene. Let's stop here for a second before we get into why this happened and when this happened in the 19th century, talking about colonization. So let's stop for a minute. I open it up for any questions that folks may have before I get into the discussion of why the map ended up looking the way it did in the 19th century. So, Daniel, is there anything in the chat or are there any hands?
Same. Man, couple things. And this is okay. So this, I've been taking this class for a long time, and I can't believe I haven't asked this question before. But so two questions. One is, so what religion or systems were the Christian Ethiopia following before Christ, like in the BCE area? Like, what was their system? And the other question is, bigger question, like considering how massive Africa is with all its resources, why were folks fighting over resources back then when there were way fewer people?
Good question. So to answer the first one, the religion in Ethiopia prior to the King Azana's conversion to Christianity, there was a god named, I think the major god was Makrem. It was a god in that region, so Ethiopia as well as Southern Arabia and Yemen. There was a lot of moon iconography, a lot of lunar iconography in that religion as well. So that's what it was. Very similar again to the beliefs that was happening in Southern Arabia at the time as well, because that region was pretty aligned ideologically. So yeah, and even when King Azana converted to Christianity in 350, a lot of historians argue it wasn't a complete conversion. And again, all these have economic reasons. He converted because the major player in the region were the Romans, the Eastern Roman Empire at the time. So some people think there were, economic reasons for his conversion, but nonetheless, he converted. But it took a while for it to get into the everyday population, just like Islam in different places we've talked about. The ruling class would convert first, and then it would make its way down through missionaries and other things to everyday society. But his conversion, yeah, it wasn't complete because we have coins that show the cross on one side and then the image for the previous god on the other. So he knew not to completely alienate his people at that time by making it a completely a state religion. So it took some time. Now, in terms of the second question, yeah, there's a lot of resources, but it takes time to reestablish things. So, and again, Africa's large, but people don't want to travel all over the place looking for resources. I mean, there's a lot of traveling to be done. So if you're a pastoralist group like the Oromo, and you're dealing with famine in Kenya, and you start, moving, looking for grazing land, you can't move forever. So you will find the grazing land. If people happen to be there, either you will form some type of symbiotic relationship, or if they're hostile to you, then you will fight. And that's what would happen. Some folks did move places, that we talked about in Central Africa and Southern Africa. When there were those succession battles, some people would move. But in other places, moving isn't as easy, because it's not as if, there aren't barriers. So there might be a mountain chain in the way, or there might be a thick forest that you don't feel like cutting down and starting over and reestablishing farms and doing all that. So you'll just fight it out. That's just, how human beings are. But in the areas where people could move, if they had an issue, they would move. In Central Africa, we see this a lot. Through the oral history, how kingdoms were established. Oh, we had a problem here, so this prince and his supporters moved to set up at another place. So hopefully that answers it. David H., go ahead.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. I was just wondering about the Ethiopian area not being colonized, yet the religion was Christian. The education seemed to be very much in alignment with what the Europeans were doing, and the weapons seemed very European. So what exactly wasn't colonized if everything is coming from somewhere else?
Well, their Christianity didn't come from Europe. So they got their Christianity early. I mean, this is before, the Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity in 325 or 312, or somewhere in the early threes, and then Azana converts in 350. So at that point in the game, Christianity is not synonymous with Europe. It's a Western Asian, even more so a North African religion. So what they were practicing and what develops is more so, it's an African Christianity. It's a strong relationship to the Coptic Church in Egypt. In fact, the patriarch in Ethiopia was often appointed by the patriarch in Alexandria in Egypt. So they're not colonized at this point, because they're again, their religion is African, essentially, or Western Asia, whatever we want to call Christianity. Their desire, the desire of the leadership like Tedros to get European weapons, I wouldn't call that an aspect of colonization as well, because I'll talk about it in a second, he didn't just want weapons. What gets Tedros in trouble with the Europeans is he's going to kidnap some English people and say, you're going to show me how to build weapons, or I'm not letting you out of jail. So he wanted that self-sufficiency. He didn't want to be dependent on anyone. And their education system was largely, again, Ethiopian-based. They had their own language. They were speaking, their written liturgical language was Ge'ez. Amharic was already a written language. So they're still operating even educationally in an African context. Now we'll talk about later on about that question of colonization, probably in the next class. Because although this victory is won, certain things start to seep in after the victory. But we'll talk about that in the next class. in the next class. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. As far as migration between empires were concerned, how is it handled? That people say people from one region or one empire migrating into another empire. How is that dealt with?
So different ways at different places. So in Ethiopia, for at this point in the game and moving it actually into the 20th century, not a whole lot of people are migrating because this becomes essentially a feudal empire. What I mean by that is the peasantry in Ethiopia is almost forced to stay where they're at, the ones that are under the control of the kingdom. So you're forced to that land, you stay on that land, you raise your family on the land, and you die on that land, and your taxes and your surplus are controlled by both the church and the royal family. So there's not a whole lot of mobility with that. I mean, unless you're the Oromo and you're not really, that system comes upon you a little bit later on. We'll talk about that with Menelik II. But there's not a lot of movement. So you can move, when people like the Oromo are moving, they're moving and they are militaristic themselves. So they're either fighting or they're forming these cooperative relationships with the people that they're moving into. In some places in Africa where people moved, that they were escaping oppression or escaping, they might be in a client situation to the new place that they go into. And that usually ends up sticking with their descendants, that you came here seeking refuge. So you're always almost like not a complete second-class citizen, but it's known that you aren't the original inhabitants of this place. The first people that go, they might be in a semi-servitude relationship. It's almost like you're paying rent to the original inhabitants of the place. And then that status stays with your descendants, that, y'all people came here when you were in trouble and we helped you out. So people remember that. So it goes different ways. And then sometimes people leave and they form real symbiotic relationships with the people that they come in contact with. And it's actually relatively peaceful. We see this with the Bantu migrations, over thousands of years from West Africa down into Central and Southern Africa, but we don't have a whole lot of evidence of violent clashes between migrating groups. So it worked out different ways, different places at different points in time in history, but those are some of the examples of what could happen when people move.
Thank you.
Daniel, I see something in the chat, but I can't read it completely. Could you let me know what it says?
Yes, it said there was a question. It asked, did Ethiopia have a much stronger trade relationship with Portugal relative to any other surrounding African kingdom? I'm trying to wrap my head around why the previous emperor you spoke about went to Portugal for help against the Oromo.
Because he didn't have the manpower to fight against them. It was a last-ditch effort on his part, I believe. He remembered what had happened a few decades earlier, so he kind of was hoping that history would repeat itself. It wasn't so much different than what we saw in the Congo, except that the Portuguese weren't looking for enslaved labor from the Ethiopians the way that they were looking from the Congo, because they were getting enough from Angola and the places that they had controlled in West Africa and even Southern Africa in terms of Mozambique. So they, at the time with the Adal Sultanate, they could afford to engage in that type of relationship. And again, they're fighting a proxy war against the Ottoman Turks. But a few decades later, I don't even know if they would have been in a position to provide much assistance other than possibly military weapons to fight against the Oromo, because they're dealing with their own things even back in Europe. Because at this time, by the time we get to Smanio's time, Portugal is about to be involved in a larger battle with the Dutch that's going to take place in Brazil and in Angola and other places. So I don't even know how much they would have actually been able to give had he succeeded in converting everybody to Catholicism. So yeah, it's very analogous to the Congolese situation, but without the element of slavery, of slavery. Good question. Anything else? I don't think so. Let me move on. Why did colonization start to happen in the 19th century? And what was Tedros about to confront? And Tedros is kind of, he sees the storm coming. This is why he wants to arm Ethiopia. This is because he sees himself being surrounded by the British and the Italians and the Turks. He sees what's coming. Slavery, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, into the 1800s. Europe has grown fat. Western Europe has grown fat off the slavery and the produce created by slavery in the Americas. All of that money has been invested into Europe's industrial development by the time we get to the 1700s. So the finances made off those goods produced in the Americas go into financing new technologies, the factory system, and so on and so forth. But to turn to turn raw materials into finished goods, you constantly need more raw materials. As new technologies are being developed, Europe is looking around and saying, we need new sources of raw materials. And in addition, when we have these finished goods that we're creating in these factories, we need markets to sell them to, or to put them in. The Europeans look and they say, Africa. We've already been taking Africans by the millions out of Africa to have their labor exploited in the Americas. Let's go in and see what's in Africa itself. So we have this general pattern emerge. And I've talked about this in classes, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, because I'll repeat this again when we do our next class, when we really talk about the entrenchment of colonialism in the first few decades, the last decades of the 19th century and into the 20th century. You get this essential pattern. You get the explorers. So European firms, European nations, they finance explorers to go into Africa. Because at this point, we're talking about the early 1800s, Europeans are just on the coast, primarily in West Africa and East Africa. North Africa is controlled by the Ottomans. North Africa and the Red Sea is primarily controlled by the Ottomans. And of course, they're Muslims, so although they're European, they're not in league with the Western Europeans. The Western Europeans are on the coast. Portuguese, the Danish, the English, to a lesser extent, the French at this point, the Dutch, they're operating on the coast. They know the coast. They know the rivalries because they've exploited them for the slave trade. But at this point, spearheaded by the British are like, slavery is not the best economic system. We can actually have a more profitable system. And they're moving to more true capitalist production. So the British say, we're going to end the slave trade. And we're going to start sending patrols throughout Africa to end the slave trade. They didn't do this because they cared about Africans. They did it because A, they found new, more profitable ways to exploit African people, and B, they wanted to punish both the French as well as the newly freed American colonies. So that was part of their rationale. So they're operating on the coast, and then these explorers that are financed by these states, they start making their way into the interior of Africa. And they're going there and they're learning about African people. They're taking notes about the African people, their rivalries, their political structures, as well as the resources that are here, the gold, rubber, diamonds, copper, whatever they could write of note. And they bring back these fanciful reports to the European public. So they have one report that's going to their financiers, whether that's a nation or a company, and they bring back this report. This is the resources that are there. These are the leaders. It's the language that they speak, the religious practices, all this. These are the early days of anthropology. Then they write these other reports, these other more fanatical reports for the general population. I talk about, the wild beast and cannibalism and the exoticism of Africa and all of that for the general population. And of course, they talk about the religious beliefs, or in their mind, the lack thereof, the paganism in Africa and these strange dances and drumming and sacrifices and all this. The missionaries get a hold of that. So then the missionaries say, well, obviously these people don't have white Jesus, so we got to come. And these missionaries are then financed by the church as well as, you know, benevolent societies and all that, because people think that they're actually going to go do good work in Africa. So then the missionaries follow. The missionaries typically get into it with the ruling classes in the places they come because they don't want your white Jesus. So then the militaries come to back up the missionaries, to back up the explorers, and also the traders. The business people have also made their way into Africa as well. And these are kind of the building blocks that begin the colonial project. So the reason for Africa starting to look like this, being territory after territory being taken over, the Europeans wanted control of African resources for their burgeoning industrial revolution. The Europeans needed copper, they needed iron ore, they needed palm oil, they needed rubber, they needed gold, they needed diamonds. And oftentimes when we think about diamonds, we're thinking about, you know, rings and jewelry. Industrial diamonds is much more important than the jewelry. So they needed all of these things, and Africa was a place that they could get them. And they begin forming these relationships with certain African leaders, protectorates, and we'll get into all of that in our next course. We'll get into this in more detail because I just wanted to touch on it so you can understand what Tedros was about to face. So seeing all this, he decides he's going to build his own more modern weapons. So he has some guns and things that he's gotten through trade and all that, but he doesn't want to be dependent. So Tedros says, I'm going to build my own cannon. And he takes this huge tree, hollows it out, and has his engineers build this cannon. And it worked, but it didn't work well. And it took a whole bunch of people to pull it and all this. It wasn't the most efficient weapon. So he realized his limitations, but you see where his mind is. You see that he's trying to become self-sufficient. The British are operating in Ethiopia. He's formed a relationship with the British because in his mind, what he wants is the technological knowledge of the British. So he allows some of these missionaries to come in and other folks to come into his kingdom. But eventually he says, you know what? Enough of this. All of you are under arrest. And here's what I want in exchange for your release. I need you to either show me how to make guns or send some people from England that know how to make modern weapons because we want to produce them in Ethiopia. And until then, you're locked up. He's holding these people hostage. Well, the British didn't particularly like that. So they send a troop, and this makes international news, the Abyssinian captives. Abyssinia is also another name for the Kingdom of Ethiopia. So, you know, these captives make news and you know, Western European newspapers, particularly the English, and they're saying, look how this African king has kidnapped these, you know, white folks, and there's even a baby there. And who knows what they're doing to the children and all this. The British send a force in to get their captives back. Now, let's go back to this image. Remember how I said he was constantly fighting against the rebellions that he had to put down in the kingdom. Well, one of the regions, the Tigray region, you know, were fighting against him and never really wanted to become a part of his united empire. They kind of just let the English in. As the English troops are coming in from the Red Sea, he's like, oh yeah, you're going to go get go ahead. No resistance to the British. So the British are able to get to the heart of his empire. They're winning victory after victory because a lot of people aren't willing to fight for him. His standing army hasn't developed the way he wants it to develop. They put up some resistance, but not nearly enough. So instead of getting captured by the British, in the midst of the battle, he kills himself. One of the most famous images in Ethiopian history is the image of Tedros killing himself rather than being captured by the British. Unfortunately, though, his child son is taken by the British. Prince Alamayu is taken by the British. He actually dies in England. He's there for a couple of years. He's taken as a child. I think he makes it to his late teens, and he ultimately ends up dying. But he was, you know, taken as a hostage essentially. When they found Tedros' body, they actually cut off his hair. He had long, you know, beautiful hair. They cut off his hair, and his hair was in England until about, I think they returned it in 2019, 2020. It got returned to Ethiopia, so it's been there a long time. But anyway, the a new emperor emerges after his death, and they continue the state building process that he began. But then the British don't attempt to seize Ethiopia. They just wanted their captives back. The Berlin Conference happens a few years later. So this happens in the 1860s. About 20 years later, the Berlin Conference happens. The Berlin Conference was a way for the European powers to figure out how they were going to divide up Africa, or the rules for dividing up Africa. Let's go back a little bit into European history. The 19th century in Europe, the beginning of the 19th century, you had the Napoleonic Wars. After the Napoleonic Wars ended, you had the Concert of Peace in Europe. So the European powers don't want to fight each other. At this time, we got emerging nations, new nations that are emerging, or new states that are emerging in Europe. Germany is uniting. Italy is uniting. These countries weren't what they are now back then. This is when they emerged. Modern Germany, modern Italy. The European nations don't want to fight each other. So they meet in Berlin and they say, all right, we all want peace of Africa. Let's not fight each other over Africa. Let's figure out the terms for how we're going to divide up this magnificent African cake. So they met and they talked between November and February, November 1884 and February 1885. And they say, all right, you're going to have to show to the other Europeans that you have effective occupation over a territory. Meaning you need to have a treaty with the ruling leaders of that territory. Or, you can just wipe them out completely. Just as long as you show that you have effective control over the territory, the other European powers will respect that claim. We're not going to fight each other over these territories. So you just need those two things. Show that you have a treaty with an African king that says that they're under your protection, and make sure that the problems that in your territory don't spill over into our territory. That's effective control. Whether you do that militarily or diplomatically, whatever, you need to actually control this area. Now, if you don't control the area, then it's up for grabs. Another European power can come in and get it because you didn't have effective control. So they all agreed about this. And there's no Africans present at this meeting. A lot of people think this is a meeting where they actually drew the lines. This is not where they drew the lines. This is where they came up with the terms of how things were going to unfold. No Africans were consulted in this meeting. But during this time period, between 1860 and 1884, again, Italy has emerged as a modern nation state. All those different little principalities like Florence and Venice and Rome, they're all united now into what we now understand as Italy. They're late to the colonial game. By the time we get to 1884, France and Britain have already got a head start on places like Germany and Belgium and Italy, and a lot of the choicest parts have been taken. The Italians and the British are in correspondence, essentially. And the British tell the Italians, hey, look, we're going to take East Africa. We're going to take, Uganda and Kenya and these areas. You should take Ethiopia. They're not united. It was real easy. We had this problem with this emperor, and he took some of our captives. Our troops went in there easily. They just basically opened the door for us. We went in there, we took over, and we got our captives. We could have took the whole thing if we wanted to, but we weren't interested. So we just got our captives and we left. So if you're interested in taking Ethiopia, it should be an easy victory. The Italians are boasted by this. So they start making moves to establish effective occupation over Ethiopia. Here's the issue, though. Things had changed since the 1860s in Ethiopia. There have been a few emperors, and a new emperor has emerged, a new king of kings, Menelik II, who actually, for a time, was a hostage of Tewodros during Tewodros's battles to control the region. He had actually taken Menelik II hostage as a child, treated him well, didn't mistreat him. But he had grown up during that time period of these conflicts. He's from Shoa, that region in the center that we show, excuse me. He ends up completing what Tewodros had started. Through military genius, through consolidation, through alliances, he's able to form an even more centralized government and then take over even more lands in the south that previously weren't a part of the Ethiopian kingdom. So he is able to conquer a larger territories that the Oromo had under their control. And he's building this empire. And right at his side is his empress. Empress Taitu. Just like Tedros, he wanted to reform education. He believed in religious tolerance to a degree. So he was going to allow people that were Muslim to stay Muslim and other things. He wanted infrastructural development, merit-based administration. So just like Tedros, he wanted people to earn their positions and not just because of how they were born. They could only do this to a certain point because it was still a feudal empire. But he's making these decisions. And just like Tedros, he also is interested in modern weaponry. So he's getting weapons from the French, weapons from the English, weapons from the Turks. He's arming Ethiopia, but he's doing so relatively quietly. So the other powers aren't really paying attention to what's going on. Because again, in their mind, Ethiopia is divided. Ethiopia will be easy to conquer. He's conquering these new lands. And again, he's sending people from the north to conquer these lands in the south, and it's creating a very exploitative relationship that's going to explode in about 100 years. And all this is also, again, Empress Taitu is right hand when all this is happening. But as this is happening, the Italians make the first overtures into Ethiopia to the king. The Italians say, we want to be in friendship with you. You know, we want to be your ally as you become this great empire. We just, united ourselves. We want to be in business with you. I said, okay. And they start exchanging gifts and things, and the Italians are heaping all this praise on Menelik. His wife, Empress Taitu, is looking at them suspiciously. She doesn't trust the Italians. Now, Menelik II is, enamored with the gifts and all this. She's like, I don't trust these people. So then the Italians come with this treaty, and they say, look, Emperor Menelik, we want you to sign this formal agreement to say that, we're allies. The agreement will say that if you choose to negotiate with the other European powers, Italy can kind of be your go-between. We can help you. We can be your middleman. We know how the other Europeans act. We can, be your negotiators for you. He says, cool, that sounds good. So they write this treaty. There's one version in the heart, and there's one version in Italy. And the key difference is the Ethiopian version of the treaty says if the emperor chooses to negotiate with the other European powers, he can choose to use the Italians as a go-between. The Italian version of the treaty says the emperor must use the Italians as a go-between for the other Europeans, essentially making Ethiopia a protectorate of Italy. When word of this gets back to Ethiopia, how the Italians are saying this is their understanding of the treaty and what they're presenting to the other Europeans to show that, hey, we have effective control of Ethiopia. It's ours. The emperor has said that he's under our protection. It gets back to Ethiopia. And the empress, who had warned Menelik repeatedly when the Italians were coming flattering him with gifts, not to trust these people, she said, King John, so this is Emperor Johannes, the emperor preceding Menelik, never wanted to cede an inch of territory. He fought against the Italians and the Egyptians for this principle. He died for this. And you, after such an example, wish to sell your country? Who will want to write your history? This is what she's saying to the emperor, because she doesn't have any fear. She's a very strong woman. This is what she said. Of course, he's shamed. He feels bad that this is happening, and now he has to go to war because the Italians they understood that this was going to end up in a violent confrontation. So when he found out about this, he's ready for war. Menelik II is ready for war. The Italians are ready for war, and they go to battle. The Italians thinking, all right, if he doesn't want to honor the treaty that he signed, then we'll put him down. We will establish effective control militarily over Ethiopia. They send in their troops. The difference is between Ethiopia in 1896 and Ethiopia in the 1860s, there's more unity. He has succeeded 4 times where Tedros didn't. There aren't as many rebellions in the regions as the time that there were with Tedros. His standing army has gotten experience, and there's some discipline, and there's a functional unity at this point. The Oromo people are actually on the side of the emperor at this moment in time. So when the Italians come to fight the Ethiopians, they're facing a more unified Ethiopia than before. The Italians also have bad navigation. They got bad maps. So they're all types of confused. And they're routed in several battles. The most decisive being the Battle of Ottawa in March 1896. The Italian forces are routed on the battlefield. And Empress Taitu has her own troops, and she's on the battlefield. And the Oromos are beautiful cavalry fighters. So they're on horseback, and they're fighting. And for this brief moment in time, there is a unity among the forces in Ethiopia, and they're able to drive out the Italians. And Italians have to sue for peace, and they can't conquer the kingdom of Ethiopia. Now, after the Italians are dealt with, things go back to empire as usual. Exploitation, advancement further south as the empire continues to grow. So, in a sense, the kingdom, the empire of Ethiopia is free from colonization. But the everyday people in Ethiopia are not free of exploitation. It's just, instead of being exploited by Europeans, they're exploited by the ruling class in Africa. This distinction isn't really looked at by Africans around the globe. So the Battle of Ottawa becomes a symbol for African people in the Americas when they find out about this, in other parts of Africa when they find out about this, and even Africans living in Europe. Because this is 1896. What do we have going on? Slavery has just ended in most parts of the Americas. Slavery's been over for, in some places, 60 years. In the United States, it's only been ended for 31 years. In Brazil, it's actually still going. Brazil, and slavery doesn't, actually no, it did in Brazil. It ended in Brazil in 1885, so 11 years earlier. So Africans in the Americas are just coming out of enslavement. The rest of Africa is being colonized, but they're coming out of enslavement in the Americas into Jim Crow racism and other forms of anti-Black discrimination that continues to this day. So they're dealing with that. And they see this example of this African nation defeating a modern European power. And it goes viral, if we use today's parlance, it goes viral. All the Black newspapers. This is a Black newspaper from Cleveland, Ohio, that hears about this on March 21st. So the battle happened in early March. This news makes its way across the world, weeks later. And it says, the parade of the African King Menelik's 100,000 soldiers at Massawa will tend to convince the Italian officer for whose benefit it was given that the conquest of Abyssinia is not an easy task. The recent disastrous battle to the Italian forces in Africa came very near if it did not quite do this. Who said an African wouldn't or couldn't fight, that he was naturally cowardly, et cetera, et cetera? King Menelik is proving himself more than a match for civilization's trained and skilled warriors. With all their improved machinery of war, more power to him. For Black people around the world, this was the real life Wakanda. This was the symbol. And then it was bolstered by the fact that many African people in the Americas had become Christian, and they're reading Psalms 68 or Psalm 60, the numbers escaping me, 64, 68, which says, princes shall rise out of, Ethiopia shall stretch forth their hands unto God. Princes shall rise out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall stretch forth their hands unto God. So they're seeing that in their Bible, and they're connecting that biblical passage to what's happening now. And they're seeing Ethiopia as this blessed place. And they're seeing this king, this emperor, and his empress as these last symbols of African self-determination and African royalty. And it's, praised all over the African world. This would be the spark of hope that would keep African people fighting against colonization, fighting against Afrophobia and anti-Black racism for the next few decades. Ethiopia and Haiti would be these symbols of African self-determination and African freedom. So again, they didn't understand the internal dynamics of what was actually going on with the everyday Ethiopian people. This is one of the things that we should, complicate when we talk about this history, because we'll get more into that in our next class. But for the outside observer, this was a powerful symbol. And this is how we're going to end this class. And at 1896, we will pick up with our next course, our next major course in June, excuse me, May. We'll have a seminar in between. We'll have a seminar in April, which we'll talk about in a second. But in May, we'll pick up with the early history of the African Renaissance, 1896 to the present, which will deal with all those contradictions, because this class is focused on those folks and others, the everyday working class people in Africa, those folks that were on those farms in Ethiopia while all this was going on, being exploited by the state and the church, the folks that were in Congo, the folks that were in South Africa, the folks that were working against colonialism in Kenya and these places, the everyday Black folks in Canada and Brazil and Haiti. That's the focus of our last major 8-week course, Early History of the African Renaissance. And we're going to look at that history through the lens of Kwame Nkrumah's book, Class Struggle in Africa. Every year that we do this class, it's a little bit different. Last year, we looked at literature. So we looked at different pieces of literature, including movies and written pieces that, you know, talked about different time periods during this era. Time before that, we did meetings. So we looked at very important meetings of African people during this time period. This time, we're going to look at this history through the lens of this book. It's a short book. It's only about 90 pages. You can get it on our course website, the digital version, or you can just buy it if you're interested. It's not that expensive. And we're going to look at the ideas that Nkrumah presents about how the 20th century and the 21st century in Africa is really a battle between the working class people and those that seek to exploit them, whether they're exploiters from Europe or they're exploiters inside of Africa. This is how he understands things. So we're going to challenge that. We're going to see if I'm not saying that it's a true analysis of history. We're going to look at to see what Nkrumah got right, what he got wrong, how this matches up with reality, the historical evidence that we have, and our present condition. So that's what we're going to be doing in May and June. So we're going to be looking at the early history of the African Renaissance through the lens of Class Struggle in Africa, this book. Next month, in April, so we don't have class next week. So next week we're off. Everybody enjoy your holiday if you're celebrating, if you're a Christian. It's Easter next weekend, so we won't have class. We start our next 4-week seminar in April. And that seminar is actually going to be facilitated by Daniel. So I'll be here as support. We'll kind of switch in positions. But Daniel Roberts III, for those of you who don't know, has been a TA for this course for, I want to say 2.5 years, but I might be off on that because the pandemic has messed up my entire understanding of time. But he's transitioned from being an undergraduate student to being a graduate student at Temple University. And in the process of being a teaching assistant for this class, he has lectured on topics in this class and various topics in African histories. Last year, he co-facilitated, or last September. When did we do the Nigeria class? Was that in September, Daniel?
I honestly, I don't remember.
I think it was September.
I thought that was like 2 years ago, to be honest.
Yeah, well, our times are getting messed up, but I think sometime last year, we'll say sometime last year, we co-facilitated a course on Nigeria. So I did half the teaching, he did half the teaching. In order to prepare him for his ultimate career as a university professor, which he's, you know, progressing quite well in, his next task is to facilitate by himself an entire seminar, so 4 weeks. And I'm going to let him tell you what this seminar will be on before we open up for our final questions and comments. So Daniel, the floor is yours. Go ahead and let the people know what you'll be teaching on in April.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ledbetter. Well, in April, I'm going to be teaching a class about one of the largest empires in West African history. So I'll be talking about the Kingdom of Kanem-Bornu in what is now modern-day Chad, also occupied some parts of what we now call Niger. Kanem-Bornu was one of the longest lasting empires in African history. It had a continuous history of about 1,000 years, give or take. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about the significance of Kanem-Bornu, how it was the first place in West Africa to develop a literary tradition, the first place in West Africa to have scholars in the sense of Islamic learning. It was also, like I said, one of the largest places. And we have indigenous oral histories written down to us and preserved for posterity in a way that other African kingdoms contemporary to Bornu don't have. So we'll be talking about that, be talking a lot about primary sources, be talking a lot about archaeology. There's some monuments that were built in Bornu that are fortunately still standing. So all of this we're going to be talking about in April. Hopefully you all enjoy the class. It's definitely been a pleasure putting this presentation together. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Ledbetter.
All right, so that is coming up in April. The registration for that will be sent out this week. So please register, share with other folks. You want to get as many eyes on this as possible. Because again, this is a territory that not a lot of folks are familiar with. We know Egypt, we know Ethiopia, we know the Zulu Kingdom. These names sound familiar, but Camden Bornu is one that needs to get more attention. And again, this is just another piece that we're adding to our understanding of African world history. So that will be out soon. The other registration link will be out soon. And as we go into the summer, then we'll start our next cycle. We've been doing this for 6 years now, and we're going to continue to go strong. So, yeah, we'll stop there. Well, not stop, but we'll open it up for questions and comments and announcements before we close out for today. Any questions?